I am having a lot of fun already. I have the great pleasure of hanging around with some friends, and we're going to be talking about some cool stuff. So, cool people, cool stuff. Sophia, hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well.
Amze Emmons
Hello.
is here from Temple University, from the Tyler School, where you are officially a professor of visual studies, or the visual studies department.
I do a couple different things. I teach in printmaking and visual studies.
Right. So printmaking is part of the visual studies school department.
It gets more complicated than that. Visual studies is part of art history. Printmaking is part of the art department, and I just kind of run around.
Wow, I really love that. That's great. And we have the great pleasure of having all the way in from the left coast,
Left coast.
Mashinka Hakopian is here with us. Hi.
Very happy to be here.
Welcome
Very
back.
happy to be home.
Yes, home for sure. Forget about the left coast. This is the one. And Danny Snelson is here. And Danny has a laptop, not because he's shy and wants to hide himself behind a laptop, but because it's going to be crucial, because we're going to talk about two things, two texts, really a text that's a text-making text of the old school, and then a computer era, AI era machine that's also a text-making machine that's based on the first one we're going to talk about. So the first is the famous one by Tristan Tzara called How to Make a Dadaist Poem. We'll talk about that a bit. And then we'll turn to a site, a machine that's been made. It's a web-based machine, so anybody can have access to it, pretty much. Danny, describe that thing briefly. Where is it and what is it?
Sure. Yeah, I can point it at the camera even.
Oh yeah, hold it. Let's see.
The sixth member of the table. So this is a Dada poem generator. It was coded by Thomas Bloom, a professor of computation at LaSalle. And
LaSalle University here in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just around the way. So I think we're talking about the site, but also its connection to Tristan Tzara.
Great. All right. So let's start with the Tzara. Amze, would you be willing to read it aloud?
Sure. To make a Dadaist poem, take a newspaper, take a pair of scissors, choose an article as long as you are planning to make your poem. Cut out the article, then cut out each of the words that make up this article and put them in a bag. Shake gently. Then take out the scraps one after the other in the order in which they left the bag. Copy conscientiously. The poem will be like you. And here you, a writer, infinitely original and endowed with a sensibility that is charming, though beyond the understanding of the vulgar.
So I have no notes, let the record show, no notes, but I'm going to ask each of you a question about this text, and you have no idea what's coming, so here it goes. Okay. Sophia, there is a moment in this thing where we feel it's in the genre of the recipe or the how-to. Can you say a little bit about that?
One moment? I mean, it starts with the word to. Like, all of it is an instruction. It's not a very good instruction
What's the most
manual,
recipe-like moment?
I
You
mean,
haven't been
I
following
think they all.
recipes lately.
I think they all. I mean,
Shake it gently.
I guess.
That's like, isn't that what you do with, you put stuff to do fried chicken, you put breading in the bag and you shake it? No?
Yeah.
You're asking the wrong person.
You're telling me that in asking Sophia, I'm asking the
No,
wrong
I'm
person?
telling you that I don't know anything about
Okay.
shaking chickens.
Okay, all right. So go a little further with that. Why would a poem about making a poem be recipe-like?
I guess that line specifically is like tactile, but also there's an element of care in the word gently.
And also, something about a recipe, it's not always true that recipes are such that anyone can do it, but for the most part, the genre of the recipe is you too can make this fine French dish. So there's a certain democratization in the recipe as a genre. Amze, conscientiously, copy conscientiously. What does conscientiousness have to do with any of this? Because it seems rather random otherwise.
Yeah, well, similar to gently, it's one of these words that kind of brings the reader into their body in a particular way. So it's asking you to write this thing, but with care, which is a kind of interesting request. Like somehow focusing on your handwriting will somehow bring you closer to becoming a writer.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Mashinka, that leads us to the next question. Here are you a writer? Now, I may have mistyped that. Is it here you are? Well, of course, it's translated from...
No, this is how it is.
It is correct? Okay. Here are you a writer? So what does writing have to do with this cut-up process of take a newspaper and really take any article? How does that make you a writer? What does writing have to do with any of this? It's more like cutting than writing, I think.
I think that very question is at the heart of this entire endeavor. And to your earlier point about de-skilling, Tzara is proposing a de-skilled method for writing, and one that's also de-emphasizing authorship, authorial agency, and a conscious crafting or manipulation of the substrate of writing.
So de-skilling could be interpreted as a radical activity, de-skilling. I think through most of the centuries since the rise of certain mechanization or certainly industrialization, pre-industrialization where certain classes formed around certain trades, the whole point was the more skilled you are, the more civilized you are, the better you're paid and the happier your life. So how do we get to de-skilling? It might be kind of a 20th century thing.
Well, given Tzara and the Dada practitioners more broadly, disdain for the bourgeoisie and for bourgeois values and for rarefied elitist notions of culture as something that one finds at a museum and other rarefied institutions, I think that's precisely the intervention that he's trying to make, is to move the notion of creativity and creative practice away from something that's associated with elite practitioners and toward this de-skilled, democratized, radically open practice that's accessible to anyone.
De-skilling as democratization. I think that's such a wild concept to a lot of people that I think it deserves another minute. Would you take it further? De-skilling as democratization, holy cow.
Well, if you think about the fact that literary practice up until that point had been seen as something that one studies at a university or an otherwise accredited legacy institution, something that one practices if one is a member of certain classes or one is clearly legible as a member of the elite, then to say that if you simply follow this recipe with its shaken seasonings and you find yourself at the conclusion of the recipe, then you also find yourself having entered into the ranks of, the erstwhile authorial elite. That's an operation of subversion with respect to class, with respect to aesthetic values, with respect to these broader systems that Dada was trying to completely implode from the inside out.
That's so great, what you just did. I'm so glad I asked a follow-up question. So great. So, Danny, wow. Sorry, this leads to a very big question.
Uh-oh.
It's a question I want to ask you, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about. So, Mashinka gave us a really good understanding in an art historical and literary historical sense of why Dada intervened when it did. We didn't really talk about the early 20th century per se, but we all understand the background, and this was the right moment for this resistance. But you would argue, I think, Danny, that now, we're recording this in 2023, that it is still incredibly relevant. So much of the modernist revolution we would think of is not quite relevant. This part of it really is relevant today. So would you be willing to tick off all the things, the trends that are happening now that make it relevant, and then we'll pick a couple of the things that you tick off and we'll follow up.
Oh, that's a tall order, I guess, to
it was
carry
a
on
big,
the,
I'm sorry, it was
the,
a
the
big,
recipe
big
metaphor.
question. But
I'll
really
take it,
relevantly
sure.
now, this is very relevant.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about, one way to think about this is a recipe. And I think the word make is really important here as well, that it's not to write, but to make. And I think rather than recipe, we could also think of it as a kind of program for a poem. And I think that's maybe where I find it the most relevance, is the idea that this program, given a set of inputs, can then output a poem for you. Obviously, we see a lot of overlap with right now in the discourse, and who knows how quickly these things change, but GPT-4 was just released. ChatGPT was released just before that. Both of these are large language models that produce natural language processing. In lay terms, basically, they're computational systems that, given input, can output what looks like literary objects, human essays, student essays. The universities are all in a kind of crisis given how good these are at producing literary works. So in a lot of ways, I think this Tzara recipe or program for a poem anticipates a whole range of computational approaches to literary production. Whether that's in poetry, which we've seen in the history of experimental writing from the 20s forward through various forms of, say, the Oulipo, which produced programs for writing, or conceptualism that produced different kinds of programs for writing. But also, I think, popular and vernacular practices in the computer that's been generating writing for us, beyond us, alongside us for the last, say, 70 years.
Before I turn to everybody else to add to this question of relevance, one follow-up for you. The moral panic about Dadaism seems to be a parallel to the moral panic about something like ChatGPT. Am I right? And if so, what does that panic consist of?
Oh, now that's actually a difficult question. Because I think there's different kinds of things, right? I mean, Dada is responding to World War I, and I think Mashinka outlaid in a lot of ways the way that Dada was trying to speak back to power at the time. The kind of panic around things like ChatGPT are also bound up with this huge new complex of issues, these massive tech conglomerates who are also, when you wrote a Dadaist poem, there wasn't anyone surveilling you using a newspaper to produce a poem, right? Now, every time we plug into one of these systems, we're being tracked, our data is being surveilled, we're leaving data shadows behind us.
So the panic has more legitimacy now than it did? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's complicated. I think, if the panic is about the originality of poetry, or the originality of student essays, a lot of my colleagues are concerned about that. Then I find that less interesting.
Less interesting, but that's actually a greater cause of the panic, it seems to me, in higher education.
It's right. Yeah, I think it's probably misplaced. I think that's the wrong panic. I think that there's plenty of panic to have. I think the wrong panic is to ask questions of originality. And I think the reason why it's the wrong question is because of the kinds of guides that Tristan Tzara and his milieu introduced to think about expanded ways of writing and making.
Okay, I turn to the three of you and to say that I usually don't, when I'm moderating such things, I don't offer such a strong opinion as I'm about to, but I think the panic is entirely, utterly, and completely misplaced, and that it has a lot to do with the poem will be like you. That's the most potentially ideologically offensive thing about this in its time, Tzara's time. How dare you say that a program, a machine that produces poetry will produce something in a machine-like way that will be like you? How dare you think of the human imagination or human originality like that? And I think that is the most misplaced, this phrasing doesn't work, most misplaced panic, part of the panic. Now that somehow the core unique identity of a 20-year-old college student, how dare we say that the product of the AI machine is more or less like you? How dare we say it's less like you? We've been less like ourselves for 20 years, 30 years, So anyway, where do you want to go with this? Remember, what we're doing here is we're producing a conversation that we hope will inform people about the relevance of this modernist radicalism to the machines of today that produce art, that produce expression. I don't know what the word is. Who wants to go first on this? I'm looking at you, but you don't have to go. Amze, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I have a couple thoughts to just kind of stir the pot a little bit. I think there's an interesting material turn that happens here that functions very differently today. At this point in time, a newspaper functioned with a kind of distant authority of an institution. It was printed, the hand of the journalist was removed, and it was moved through a machine that made it legible as the truth. And then it was disassembled and it was rewritten by hand. So the autograph of the writer was reintroduced into it. And that meant something at that point in time. Whereas I think now the nature of sampling and appropriation and collage is very different culturally. And original works kind of never leave the rectangle now. They sort of happen there, they move around there, and then they're sort of shifted. So I'm sort of interested in how ideas about originality have so changed since this moment in time.
Sophia?
Well, first, ChatGPT will not gossip with you. I've tried to make it gossip with me. I think there's...
You're just throwing that out.
Yeah, just in case y'all want to go try it, it's not going to work.
Therefore, the poem will not be like you because you like to gossip.
Yes,
Well,
but...
maybe, I wonder if we can get in a few minutes the Drexel machine, or the LaSalle machine to do anything like that. But go ahead.
I think there's a tension with, like, with this line, the poem will be like you. The visibility of this mechanism, the embodiment of this procedure. Like, I have to physically choose an article and cut it up, and then I am writing it conscientiously, and I am involved in this process, and I know how it's working because I'm the one doing it, and that is to me very different than what's happening in algorithms because of today, because I don't see those mechanisms and I don't actually understand how they're working. I think that is a key difference in the panic of them, in a sense.
I think that's a really, really important point to make, and a fantastic one. I was drawn to that section too. Here you are a writer, the poem will be like you. You're so right that the way that algorithms operate is totally opaque. Here you understand how each step is building toward another. The mechanism is clear. The algorithm is what we call a black box. The rationale is completely hidden from view and totally inaccessible. There's also the idea, this automation bias or magical thinking around AI and algorithms, that they will necessarily produce objective or results that are totally dislocated from human intervention. And it would be easy to think about something like this, to say this is a chance poem, right? It's a poem governed by chance. There's no human...
Not this one, but the poem it produces.
Yes, sure, yes, the poem it produces. And not to recognize the degree of human agency that's being exercised. The same is the case with algorithms and algorithmic logic, that there's always a human in the loop, that the human who trained it, the human who determined how it would operate, the human who collected and labeled the data that went into the algorithmic model. And so that moment, I think, is a really important one, that there is a human here and there's a human in the algorithmic loop.
So Danny, you wanted to follow up, but I'm not going to let you because I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Okay. Infinitely original. Mm-hmm. When I first read this, I thought that's just hilariously ironic. He knows it's not original. Second time I read it, very ironic, charmingly ironic. The 100th time I read it, I thought, he's not being ironic. Mm-hmm. So insofar as he's not being ironic, or insofar as you agree that this is not ironic, how would you explain infinitely original? How could something produced in this way or by that machine be infinitely original?
I mean, on a technical way, and I want to go back and say more things, but I'll say technically, infinitely original, this is not all that different than a blockchain, which is a random string of letters and numbers, alphanumeric symbols. So it's infinitely original in the definition of, say, random chance, right? So if you draw these words one by one, you're going to get an original string of words.
It will not be reproducible in this same pattern.
Yeah, so I think it decouples, I guess, a kind of question of originality from sort of writerly invention, which is always, as we know, bound to genres and forms and echoes of other literary inventions. Where here you have something that is technically infinitely original in the sense that every word is an original placement that you can't reproduce. This is something that Duchamp and others in this milieu thought about quite a bit. What does it mean if you throw a piece of string on a table and it lands in a particular kind of way? That is an infinitely original placement of string. Now, if I can step back for 1 second, because I love this conversation about ideology, and I think that one of the choices here, is you choose an article, and the poem will look like you. So you have these random set of words, but what newspaper did you use? That newspapers
In
have
what
ideologies.
language?
How
In
are
what
you
language?
selecting your data set?
Which
Yeah.
article do you choose? And those newspapers also, and this is drawing from Mashinka's work, carry their own biases. In the same way their algorithms carry biases, you can tie that up to like a newspaper's bias in reporting.
Subjectivity. The machine has a subjectivity in the sense of bias.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you have these kinds of things, I would call this like a writer newspaper interface, kind of like a human computer interface. But like the poem emerges from some shared space between you and your own biases and how you selected the thing you selected, and this like much more mysterious thing, which is ideology, or which is a kind of black box algorithm, which is compiled by untold numbers of people and untold numbers of perspectives. So I think it's really a smart precursor to the kinds of dilemmas we have when we're trying to produce infinitely original work using our computational devices.
I'm going to ask these three another question, and while I'm doing that, I would like you to put in a text into the box, whatever text, and have it do its thing, and then read it back out to us and explain it. Okay, so here's the question for the three of you. In this Tzara situation, we have a triangulation of three entities, three beings. We have the person doing the cutting. We have the program that instructs you exactly what to do. And then we have the output. So we have three things. So I don't know what we'd call them. We'd call them maker, program, output, something like that. Okay. What about here? Do we have the same three elements? And if they are the same three, can you create some kind of ratio that explains, draws the line from here to here? Or is it different?
Broadly speaking, I mean, I don't know how this was trained. I tried to look up what their process of coding it was, so I don't know what data sets were used, what the coding looks like. But certainly, broadly speaking, if we think about this as an algorithm, which it very much is, because the kind of easy way to describe what an algorithm is a recipe, and this is certainly a recipe. So by the transitive property, it's also an algorithm. But ironclad logic. So yeah, there's an input, output, and an algorithm operating here. I assume that the base.
So what is Danny playing a role here? You keep going doing your thing.
Yes.
The equivalent to me cutting the newspaper is Danny putting in the text that he's doing now?
Mm-hmm. The prompt. But when I say algorithm, I'm not just thinking about like a machinic logic. I'm thinking about a socio-technical system. An algorithm isn't just a technical artifact, right, or part of a technical system. It's socio-technical. There are people bound up with it at every stage of its development and at every stage of its output.
Amze, your thoughts on this?
I don't disagree, but
Disagree with what?
With the idea that there's a kind of one-to-one relationship, but there's something in there that's a kind of rock in my shoe that I can't.
What is that? What's the difference?
Well, I guess the unknowns with something like ChatGPT, which is not exactly what we're using. There's systems that develop that algorithm and that data set that are just I don't know, somehow beyond our kind of reach in terms of what their motivations are and how they're developed.
In a negative sense.
I'm not sure with our example, but I would say with the kind of AIs that we're talking about, I mean, they want to make my participation, I become the consumer, whereas I feel like in this model, I'm a producer.
Oh, good. So producer and consumer get merged in this model, and you become more of a consumer than a producer. So you feel a little less like an artist and more like a participant in some kind of venture, commercial venture.
I probably could find the edges to begin troubling that, but I would have to spend a fair amount of time just sort of poking around inside of the black box to figure that out.
But you're saying, and I'm sorry that my job is to reduce things, so
yeah.
You're saying overall that this feels better as participation in some kind of art idea or movement than that. That doesn't feel like you're participating in some
And some of it
creative
might
activity.
that may change over time, but at this point, it's a question around legibility, like the kind of motivations in the project of someone running a newspaper are kind of legible to me.
Running a newspaper, right? Because they were supposedly trying to put the word out about things that are happening and opinions and so the motivation would be of the newspaper producers and writers and editors would be a little more transparent or a lot more transparent than this.
Yeah.
All right, Sophia, quick thought on this before we turn to the machine.
I don't know if I know enough about how it works, if I'm being honest. I feel like I'm coming back to the poem would be like you. In this, I feel like the poem would more so, in fact, be like me. And the accidents of
Which
my
poem?
circumstance,
This
like
poem?
the poem I make based on these
Because
instructions.
there's
the accidents of my
craft
circumstance and
involved or something?
decision is entirely my own. But I feel like with this, I'd just be more of a co-conspirator with what it would also look like for everyone else.
What you just said made me think the following. Tell me if it's way off. But producing this is essential because you have to arrange it on a table or a floor and very likely on a piece of paper, which then might result in you using tape or glue to create a collage of words, and in a certain type. And there were various typefaces because if you were working on, well, one article would be in the single font, but if you were working on multiple articles, which you can do here, you can get advertising fonts from 1915 or something like that, and it would become very much a modernist collage of words, which could be thought of as an artwork and have an aesthetic value that you presumed for it. Here, wipe it out, do another one. Most people do not keep and display or even post to social media their ChatGPT outcomes. So there is I did it once, it was completely ridiculous, but there is an art, a modernist art involvement, participation, intervention going on with this. And maybe that's very naive, what I'm just saying, but I don't know. Mashinka, you were going to say something?
briefly wanted to intervene and say that there are some people doing really interesting literary work with GPT-3. For example, Kealato McDowell, who has published a few books co-written with GPT-3, including Air Age Blueprint and Pharmaco AI. And their work really keenly explores what it means to think about these machines as collaborators and co-conspirators. And I also want to add one term to complicate this consumer versus producer, binary. When you're interacting with things like ChatGPT, I don't think this is the case with the Dada poem generator. You're also a worker. You're a data worker because all of the input that you're giving it is being used to further train and refine the operations of the model.
Danny, we're going to turn to you. I also want to add that the tripartite model breaks down here because the Dada piece, how to make a Dadaist poem, is actually a fourth element in this because it is... Okay, so what did you do? What did you find? What do you think?
Oh, I was so excited when you asked us to think about this because I do think it is this really great kind of early example of generative text. I tried to go back into the code itself. It runs a really simple JavaScript. So what the code does...
This LaSalle thing. Do you want to say the URL so people could find it? Is it a difficult one?
No, if you just take the URL of the Dada poem in the ModPo course and delete the parts up to the name, you'll get the author's name. So this is Thomas Bloom's website at LaSalle. But you can also always, and this is something I'm always telling my students, whenever you come across something like this, just reveal source. Like take a look, even just for a moment, even if you don't understand what all the code is doing, see what the code is, how it's working.
What did you find out?
Well, I found out a lot of things. It's not exactly Tzara, but it's an update. So it's a pretty minimal JavaScript. He also wrote a Yahtzee generator, which I was happy to discover.
Are you a Yahtzee person?
I'm not, but it showed up in in an episode of True Blood that we've been rewatching, and Evan Rachel Wood, as a vampire with infinite time, decides that she loves Yahtzee, which I've been thinking about a lot. That's been kind of haunting me. If you have infinite time, of course, Yahtzee's perfect. But okay, that said, so the generator, it's a pretty basic JavaScript. What it does is it takes all of the words from any input. It erases all the punctuation, which Tzara doesn't tell you to do. But then it also removes all of the capital letters, which Tzara doesn't tell you to do.
Replaces them with lowercase.
With all lowercase, and he's trying to streamline, I think, the output. And then you get it does draw random words, which computers are very good at. It has random line lengths, which they're good at. And then he appends new punctuation to the end, a random set of semicolons and periods. So it's poems defined by periods and semicolons that uses all of the words from the original input.
When the period is introduced, is there a capitalization at the beginning of what would be a sentence?
It capitalizes the first letter of each line. Traditional poetry stuff, right?
So it's flush left, ragged right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I can sort of put this out here.
Well, I think we should probably put it here, except that's going to make it hard for you to read it. But we'll say a few more things so that people can see this. And while people are seeing this, say a few things, and then we'll go back and you can read the input and the output.
Yeah. Well, and I'll add, so this website, and I'm really interested in how these things appear. So that's the structural level, the code. But when you load this website, every time it has a pre-source set of, it has a poem by Robert Frost.
Yeah,
right?
why? Why Frost? I mean, we all know why, but
Fascinating. It's
it's
I think
a poem.
Yeah, and I think computer scientists love Frost because of the road not taken kind of thing.
You mean they're misreading of the road not taken?
Yes, exactly. So
You're mocking computer scientists' understanding of poetry.
I'm not mocking it. I'm a full fan of these kinds of things, and I think it's interesting though. Instead of a newspaper article, it's a poem that's subject to the same operations. So I was thinking about our conversation we just had about the poem will be like you. So I was wondering if we could also use the Dada generator as a portrait generator. So I found Thomas Bloom's bio, and I put that in.
That's what you put in?
Yeah.
All right, turn this machine around and give us the input and the output.
Okay, so his bio, traditional, right? Thomas Bloom, PhD, associate professor. Dr. Bloom is first and foremost a teacher. Even when he held research positions, he would take every opportunity to do some teaching, ... An academic bio, as you see on most websites. The output, and I'll say, I think my favorite design element of this webpage is that there's one button, and the button just says Dada, which I was thinking is so because buttons are always press here or submit or click, and I like the idea of Dada as a verb, and also a Dada button that randomizes text. So I think that was a really brilliant choice.
You care about design.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll read the poem that it output. A held taught in PhD introductory he, art is and. Some hardware general with programming research teacher likes has. Architecture Sal. Has foremost a of since. Study law even. Art. To theory physics including and Bloom client a Thomas. Probably a good breaking point. It continues forward, and it doesn't quite, so it has the echoes of the original. Maybe we can do some reading together. But I hear a lot of echoes of the original version, but also it renders each of these words kind of strange. It certainly doesn't have anything like a standard grammar. It is, in that sense, I think, infinitely original in the sense that I would never, by my own hand, put these same words in the same order. So, yeah, but I'm also happy to input any other text that people want to see.
What I think would be fun is if you pass the laptop over to Sophia. We'll ask Sophia to put something in, maybe not an academic bio, but a poem. And so I'll turn to the other three of you to ask if we were to close read the output as a poetic interpretation, what would happen? And how would we hold off those who would be critical of that activity as a waste of time? Or, where do you go with that? What does a close reading of a artificially produced piece of text mean? Or does it forestall or forbid close reading?
It begins to tell you about the system of its making. And the kind of limits and possibilities of that. In the same way that someone might ask, why look at the sixth Warhol of an electric chair? The distinctions between the first and the last, you can begin to see the limits of reproduction in some ways.
Silk screening or something?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So say more about that. That's interesting. How does that parallel here? I guess you're saying that the Warholian idea would be that you would keep reproducing it using the machine to the point where it changed, and the sixth printing would be interestingly not like the fifth, fourth, third, first.
And at a certain
original.
point, you stop seeing the subject, and you start to see the object and its relationship to its own production.
That is a great point. Anybody want to follow up on that? You stop seeing the subject.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I think it's really useful for people who don't have coding backgrounds to look at generative text like this, because that object starts to be the character of the code itself. So you hit that Dada button enough times, and you start to get a sense of how the code is working. I think this is one of the ways in which poetry is still an interface to understand some of the more difficult and thorny computational issues that Mashinka and others work on in ChatGPT, are these much more sophisticated algorithms that, reading that code is thoroughly impossible for any human to do. But by experimenting with it, iterating it, playing with it in the same way that Warhol would play a silkscreen over and over, you can start to understand its character. And I think that this is a real value that poetry still has to understanding these impossibly complex technological systems.
Before we turn to Sophia's work here, let's talk about what advantages one derives from the move from subject to object in the sense you mean. I assume that you think it's pretty cool to do that. Why?
Well, as someone who makes things, you can sort of move past an initial read of a story and begin to understand choices around style, materiality, composition. It just begins to get sort of deeper and more complicated.
Interesting. Danny, Mashinka?
That was so poetically put. I have nary a word to add.
Well, in that case, I'll add, I was taught here at the Penn School of Poetry and Poetics, and was taught to resist.
Is that what it's called, the Penn School of...
I'm calling it that. Well, I was taught to resist a certain kind of artifice of absorption, as one of my mentors, Charles Bernstein, would like to say, that by starting to understand the object rather than the subject, which in literary terms maybe to get past the kind of representational or narrative surface and into the functioning, the working of the language, the working of how the text is generated. That seems to be a value in a lot of ways, both in terms of understanding computational systems, but also just to understand ourselves and our relationship to language better, right? That language doesn't come without form, it doesn't come without design, it is not a transparent communicator of pure ideas that we can share with each other. It's always a process of mediation. And in that process, things are lost, noise is introduced, and...
What's introduced?
Noise.
Noise. Say more about that.
I'm trying to stop myself from going on a long Michel Serres anecdote to say, noise is introduced whenever you're transmitting a signal in communication theory or communication circuits. Those signals are always compromised by noise, which is generally defined as the thing you're not listening for. So whatever you're not listening for in a signal becomes noise. But that relationship between signal and noise can be flipped if you listen to the noise. Right? If the noise becomes a signal, say you're really listening to the character of static, then that static becomes the signal that you're listening for, and you can understand the way that, I guess, as we desperately try to communicate with each other, as I try to submit my signals to you, if you understand the noise on those channels a bit better, then we can have better communication.
Is there noise in the far-off iteration of the Warhol silkscreen? Is that noisy?
Yeah, entirely. I mean, he starts with a newspaper clipping that's this big and then blows it up very large, and then in a way that is almost de-skilled, sort of haphazardly produces duplicates. Thinking about a kind of reductive relationship to language, if you think about language as like an operating system for how we conceive of ourselves and the world, one thing that poetry can do is sort of break those structures, and something like this, where it so thoroughly breaks it, we begin to see the limits of that operating system and also the new system that it's functioning inside of.
Great. Sophia, what did you do? And did you produce something beautiful?
I don't know. Your mention that, or your consideration that this could be making a portrait, I honestly just thought of Stein's If I Told Him, a complete portrait of Picasso, and I wanted to see what it would
You
look
put
like.
an experimental
I wanted to see
portrait,
what it would look
already
like.
experimental, into a device that makes it an experimental portrait.
Yeah, I kind
We
of
are
wanted
much
to
too
see.
meta. Where's the frost when you need the frost?
I just wanted to see if it would actually resemble the original
I think
enough.
you should read. Let me read the original, and you can read the output, because I'm very good at Stein. If I told him, would he like it? Would he like it? If I told him, would he like it? Would Napoleon? Would he like it? If Napoleon, if I told him, if Napoleon, would he like it? If I told him, Napoleon, would he like it? If Napoleon, if I told him, if Napoleon, this is damn good. If I told him, would he like it? If I told him, now, not now, and now, exactly as kings, feeling full for it, exactitude as kings.
It's very good.
I really like that poem. So what happens to it?
Well,
Does it
wanna
become
hear?
more I do want to.
Shudders I weather now, resembling and would exactly, and feeling all I land, it and is him exactly. So it and now and as so I told, resembling if there do I told at, as exact because king's I or told as him exactly judge him all and as he him first, he now you, and exactly all him land, full exacted to Napoleon was date the him, as it as first hold, and he shares, and like do for he now exactly proportions, as they first would shudders, and shudders there would now have exactly first, and him Napoleon if came trains. It there, so him if I, as I exactly, and as he.
Oh, that's marvelous.
That's so good.
That's marvelous.
Perfect.
So I think we should all take a turn at saying something about that output, and then we'll wrap it up with some final thoughts. Who wants to start? I mean, I don't mind starting to say it's very Steinian that the machine, the poem will be like you. It's Stein. I mean, it's a different Stein. I don't know that it's more random. I just think it's marvelous. More Stein. Give me more Stein. It gave me more Stein. I don't know.
I think this is, I don't mean to be negative about it, but I love it. But I feel like this could possibly fuel someone who says that Stein isn't poetry to begin with, because they're like, oh, this computer just scrambled it and it still makes no sense and it sounds the same. I just am curious if that would ever, if that's like a concern of operations like this against generative poetry.
Making already weird text, affirming the weirdness of the text. Therefore, it's just
But
as
without the
irrelevant as it
work.
always was to you, so walk away. Yeah, okay. Danny?
I wish I got more spam like this. That's so good. I want to go back to something really inspiring that Amze said earlier about the autograph in this, or the handwriting. One of the things that I like to think about, and this is Lisa Gittleman's idea, that raw data is an oxymoron. That there's no such thing as data. That data is always parsed by humans, right? The technical word of data, which is not too far from Dada, is that parsed data becomes information, and that data doesn't exist outside of human readers. And so I loved that Al, that you read the Stein out loud, but I love, Sophia, that you read that poem. And so I think in some ways you can think about how the poem will be like you, in the sense that you generated it and you parsed it. So you did all those selective things. You chose a piece. You put it through. I don't know how many times you pushed the Dada button. Did you push it once or more than once? Twice. So you can choose how many times you want to iterate. And then when you read it out, I think like through vocalizing this otherwise random set of letters, it really did become a portrait of you, and less a portrait of Picasso, I think, and even further than that, a portrait of Stein. So I think that's.
Did you feel you
my
were
2 cents.
expressing yourself? It's sort of a funny question.
Sure, yeah.
How cool
I
is
mean,
that?
I think I was expressing, yeah.
Speaking is not in itself expressing, but
Isn't it?
it was a self-expression, meaning yourself came out.
Well, and
somewhat.
I made the selection. I picked what I wanted to
You felt
jumble.
ownership a little bit of it.
And it becomes such a naturalized improvisatory practice to read things out loud, but we all make so many choices just in that process of reading. And poetry always brings that to the fore. So you have to choose, how do you handle the enjambments? Where do you pause? Do you pause at the end of the line? Do you run on to the next line? And this generator really forces you to pause. It's like, period. semicolon, period. And so I think it structures how you read it, and you as a human reader are having to interface with that and navigate how much you pick up on or discard some of its formal instructions.
Amze, your thought on the Stein result?
It made me think about like the sort of tyranny of the search that we kind of live in digitally, where we're constantly putting things into a search field, versus the sort of adjacency that one experiences in a library, where you might choose a book based on the spine or something, and the nature of choice and selection in that part. And my experience of hearing the two was that it sort of combined both of them in some way. There was the choice of the poem and some adjacency in the results, but it functioned inside of a kind of search box in a kind of funny way.
Wonderful. Mashinka.
I loved it, and I thought the fact that it was as Steinian or more Steinian than Stein shows us that using human exceptionalism and human creativity and genius as metrics of evaluation, these are woefully outdated metrics, and I'm happy to see them relegated to the dustbin of history.
Wow. Sophia, your thought on this?
I don't know if I can beat dustbin of history.
Not an original phrase.
Not at all.
About as
But you know, it
radical
is
as
a phrase
could
that is
be.
like me, and a phrase, and here I am a writer of it.
Did you have fun doing it?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Why? How?
I mean, I think part of my trepidation with exploring programs like this is what I stated earlier, is that I don't actually understand how they work, and that makes me stressed out. Like I do feel this strange tension where maybe it's ego, where I don't want to make something that I don't understand how I made it.
Right.
But I don't know, something about something about doing it here and seeing a result that actually was close enough to the original text that I felt comfortable with it, maybe is like freed me to try it a little bit more, to be more generous with letting go of the process.
I'm going to regret asking this question of you, because I never want to assume that you or anybody else can speak as a representative of a generation.
Here we go.
But I think in the room, four of us are more relaxed about, you described yourself as anxious about not knowing the programming, the, coding. I think I'm less anxious about that.
I'm acutely anxious.
You are. Okay, so this is not a generational thing, but you seem more hesitant than many people, roughly of your generation, about going ahead and trying this out, diving into it. Where does that come from? This is because you're infinitely original, I suppose, but...
No, that's not true. Where does it come from?
Yeah. Why are you worried about all this?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know where it comes from.
About systems? I understood you to mean that you were worried about the technical infrastructure.
Not knowing the
Yes.
technical infrastructure, but going ahead and participating.
I mean,
I'm just scared what it means. I don't know what it
there
means.
are manifold horrors encoded within them. I think it would be not only foolish, but unfathomable not to be concerned at this point.
So maybe I'm the odd one. I don't
not
feel more rather than less or the same level of alienation doing this as I feel about all kinds of things. And maybe I'm just an idiot of a certain age. I just sort of accept that alienation is going to be minute by minute the main quality of my experience. And so this is just, not knowing what's in there. I don't want to look. I want to theorize about looking under the hood of the car, but I don't actually want to look under the hood of the car. Not like you. You love to look under both of you. All of you. I'm the only one who doesn't like to look under the hood. Okay, final thoughts. We're going to go around. Anything that this discussion, this really wonderful discussion, and I think instructive discussion that we just had. I think anybody watching this, I hope to think that anybody watching this will feel something of an introduction to the relationship between the Dada moment and today, and what's happening aesthetically and theoretically with the tools. So, but now let's just throw one more thing out that you meant to say but didn't have a chance to. You, Sophia, who took so many notes, must have at least a few things in there that you'd like to add.
Many of these notes were from when we did this poem in ModPo.
Oh, so they're old notes.
Old notes.
How do they stand up, these old notes?
I did write one note on the back about how I don't understand AI's place. This is like my fault, not that it doesn't have a place, but I'm having a difficult time understanding algorithms and AI's place in writing poetry when I to my knowledge, AI operations draw on what is known and knowable, but if I'm invested in a poetry that is trying to make what could be, how do they collaborate? That's why I'm scared, I guess. That's why.
Fair enough, and well said. Amze?
I was interested in how this process and the kind of digital version of it both contained a fair amount of pleasure, and my own relationship to creativity is always intrinsically interested in finding pleasure in making, and so that made me kind of hopeful that there could be space for digital tools to generate kind of chance outcomes.
Mashinka?
To go back to a very early point, I think that Danny made, I'm interested in the sort of misplaced anxieties around the technologies that we're talking about. Not the loss of human exceptionalism or creativity, but rather what we should be thinking about is the data sets and corpora that are used to train the large language models, or the fact that Kenyan data labelers who were vastly underwaged were making something like $3 an hour in the training of ChatGPT. So I think if we can shift away from the mourning of human creativity toward the recognition of what's undergirding these technologies, we will have done something wonderful today.
This goes back to our conversation about the various kinds of panics. One panic is covering the other. The panic of our students will never really learn for themselves anymore, that panic, as opposed to the panic of the exploitation, and the cruelty in the making of these things by some big companies and ventures that really have a lot to gain, financially from it. Danny, final thought?
Yeah, and I think following on that, I'm so inspired by this conversation. I think it's something I want to use in my classes as well. And what I would do is I want to end on a note maybe of empowerment to Sophia and others. to open the code, look, click on the JavaScript. It's only about 20 lines long. It's really short, and like any good coder, he's written in comments that tells you what each one of the expressions do. So it's also teaching you what it's doing. And the easiest thing you can do, here's what I would suggest, is just to replace something with something else. So find the line where he tells you, remove all the punctuation, I've replaced it with semicolons and periods. You could just replace that semicolon with an exclamation point and see what would that do to your portrait of Picasso, right? And I think by starting small, by playing with some of these tools, playing with the code behind some of these really early versions of iterative generative text, I think it helps to better understand the invisible systems that are really determining everything we do online. And so in that way, I think it's a really good microcosm for some of these really big questions that I think we're all struggling with right now.
I have two quick final thoughts. One is about impersonation, and the other is about a piece of the Tzara, the third line that I never understood. About impersonation. So one of the panics is our students need to find their own voice, and now what will happen is, if somebody puts in to ChatGPT, what would a trained chemist say about this particular chemistry problem that I've been assigned for my homework? And what the result you get is probably at this point pretty bad, but with a chemistry question. But the result you will get will be leading you to either fake the impersonation of a professor of chemistry, or realize you're not there yet. But if you submit it, it's an impersonation, and if it's discovered, you will get an F. And yet the same effing teacher professor is going to say, what I want you to do in this advanced chemistry course is begin to understand the discourse of academic expert chemists. And that's where it's impersonation anyway. And it's just one aspect of what's wrong with our upset about this. I want to say to teachers who say that's the end of my teaching because they will produce all this stuff I'm going to be spending all my time trying to suss out who's cheating. And what I want to say to that person is, if you teach in a way by assigning really intricate and interesting and individuating assignments, and they try to use ChatGPT, you're going to get fascinating results which you will clearly easily be able to decipher as such. Mm-hmm. Or they won't be able to do it because even they will understand that this is a bad result and it will teach themselves. So change your pedagogy instead of... So anyway, that's my first point. And it has a lot to do with teaching poetry, I think, because I have always striven as a teacher of poetry to try to create assignments that are not reproducible, that are just so weird-ass that any attempt to get help from tools and applications would be better than nothing. Second final thought, the third line. Choose an article as long as you are planning to make your poem. Was this written in German originally, Swiss German? Because it seems like a bad translation, but let's take it as English, all right? So I'm looking at a newspaper and I'm deciding which article to read. It's going to be the one that seems to be most urgently relevant to me. I care about war, so I read the article about war. I worry about the price of gasoline, I go right to that article, whatever. Here is the rationale for choosing this article, the one that will make a poem. It's the one that is as long as the poem you are planning to create.
Wait, I thought it meant like don't cut out this article unless you plan on making something new. Like don't do this.
Choose an article as long as you're planning.
Don't defile the newspaper unless you're actually going to do the prompt.
Oh, I love that reading of it. I don't know,
You're
Sophia.
already planning to make a poem.
As long as you are is a fantastic. I mean, it actually our favorite Sid Corman poem has "As Long as You Are" in it. I think what it means is if you're going to figure out you only have a certain amount of time to do this activity, so pick an article that's the right length for the activity. And so that is the reason why I read, when I'm following this, why I read this article as opposed to that in the New York Times. It's basically the length of the activity that's of the ideas or the language that's the use of the article in my brain is going to produce. I just love that weird way of choosing your topic of today's news. Well, today's news is that we spent more than an hour talking about this marvelous topic and relevant topic. I want to thank all of you for doing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.